Everyone. I'm Randy Bandman, and on behalf of the Entertainment Law section of the Beverly Hills Bar Association, welcome you to today's program, Disney and OpenAI Make a Deal, where Julia Cherlow of Bird Marella LLP and David Shraga, the Media Mediator, will examine the pivotal licensing deal recently announced by Disney and OpenAI, how it reshapes the future of AI-generated content and the potential industry implications as the story unfolds. Julia Cherlow is a partner at Bird Marella and a nationally recognized entertainment trial attorney who represents guilds, talent, and other IP owners in bet the company disputes. Her practice spans cutting-edge issues at the intersection of entertainment, technology, and intellectual property, including high-profile litigation involving film, television, and digital media. David Shraga is a mediator, specializing in entertainment, media, and intellectual property, drawing on more than 20 years of legal experience in Los Angeles. His background includes work as both an entertainment and IP litigator and a senior in-house executive at Miramax and NBC Universal, where he developed deep expertise across film, television, and streaming. Thank you, Julia and David.
Randy, for that lovely introduction. Julie, it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Absolutely.
Your credentials are a tough act to follow, but I'm going to try and keep up with you. And I think really though, what your resume speaks to is the really multifaceted perspective that you bring to this conversation. And I think that's part of what makes your insights so valuable into this conversation we're going to be having today about a really high stakes issue in Hollywood and in the litigation world that involves a spectrum of stakeholders like the folks I think you represent. And so maybe I could set the stage here for our audience today very quickly. Obviously for the past couple of years, we've been in a world where AI companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, Google, are in a race against each other to develop these generative AI tools, and they are changing the industry, and they are, of course, changing our world in myriad ways. And as they charge forward, a slew of lawsuits have been filed against these companies involving copyright claims and other legal theories, where they're basically being sued for using, in a host of different ways, the IP that's owned by third parties without their permission or payment. And this includes suits by authors, by publishers, by our own big Hollywood studios here in town, including Disney, NBCU, Warner Brothers, and others who have brought these claims. And I know we're going to talk more about this in detail as we keep going. And so on December 11th, 2025, just before the holidays, the story took its latest big turn when Disney and OpenAI announced, in their own words, a landmark agreement to work together and bring Disney's beloved characters to OpenAI's Sora platform. And of course, it seems like there's new announcements virtually on a daily basis in terms of what's happening in the world of AI collaboration, in terms of these lawsuits that have been filed and moving through the courts. And obviously, this is a deal that's groundbreaking. It's reverberating through our industry. And we're going to dig in today to what it means for the entertainment industry and this ongoing litigation involving AI as well. So I thought that maybe we could start out by saying or talking about what is this deal between Disney and OpenAI really? I mean, are we talking about a licensing deal for all purposes, or seems like maybe there's something more limited and strategic that's going on here?
Absolutely, David. And thank you for your kind words and introduction. It's really an honor for me to be able to have this conversation with you, given your decades of experience in the field. And I look forward to a lively conversation about this. So the Disney OpenAI deal, there are still many questions because it has not yet been rolled out. We don't know all the specific nitty-gritty, but we do know generally the material deal points that have been agreed to. And so to your question, is this a licensing deal for all purposes? Absolutely not. I look at this as Disney, it's kind of sticking its toe into the AI pool while still preserving a lot of control, as opposed to just a wholesale grant of use of its, jealously guarded IP. I mean, Disney in particular is known for how carefully it has protected and policed its IP over the years. And so initially, when I heard about the deal, I was a bit surprised that Disney was the first mover. But we'll get into a little bit more of that over the course of our conversation. I think it makes a lot of sense for Disney for a number of reasons to be the first mover in this space. But we can talk maybe through some of the deal points of the deal. First off, the term of the deal. So it's a 3-year term. I believe it's scheduled to begin in early 2026. I continue to go on to OpenAI, and I don't know if you've experimented with this at all, David, to see if anything's available yet, but not quite yet. I'm sure that there are a lot of deal lawyers, transactional lawyers billing around the clock,
Yeah, there's I think a lot
finalizing
of
all these terms.
must be a lot of fine points they're still working out because, as you mentioned, they announced the deal in December, but they basically said they're still working on papering this long form effectively, which I think is probably going to be a very nuanced and complicated agreement that's going to have to evolve given the terms that we're talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, there's so many unknowns. I do not envy those transactional attorneys trying to build for the future to protect this very valuable IP. So the term of the agreement is 3 years. And what has been licensed to OpenAI is about 200 different characters and creative elements that are Disney, Marvel, Pixar, and Star Wars elements. And this includes everything from props to costumes, vehicles used within these universes, and even iconic environments.
I mean, it's really the holy grail of the Disney IP we're talking about in terms of these characters.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I don't know about you, but I look forward to experimenting with it myself.
Absolutely. But so maybe it's interesting to also to highlight what's not involved or included in these deal terms.
Well, for one thing in particular, performer likenesses or voices, those are not included. And for obvious reasons, I think that Disney was trying to create a deal where it didn't have to deal with any issues of complicated chains of ownership. Whereas here, it's relatively straightforward, 200 characters or creative elements that it owns whole cloth and has the ability to control.
Yeah, it's an interesting aspect of the Disney business specifically because so much of it is based upon copyrighted characters and animated works, and they typically are created on a work for hire basis. And
Right.
performers who are involved in the scripted programming that they do and some of the voice work, but they really sort of have tried to separate that out. And I think that puts to the side, at least for now, dealing with a lot of complicated permission issues like you mentioned, but guild issues as well that come into play when we talk about involving these performers too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so it seems like what folks will be able to do is, create these short user prompted videos making use of the Disney IP and also create images based on user prompts of the IP. But this is not going to be full scale commercial exploitation of the IP at all.
Yeah, so what's really fascinating about this deal is it takes us into really a whole new world, right? Where the users are able to access this underlying IP and create their own works. And I know there's been discussion by Bob Iger, and it's been announced at CES and some other places along the way that this is going to provide an opportunity for some of this content to be on Disney Plus. And so, um, maybe it's worth sort of talking about this new dynamic when it comes to using Disney's IP and sort of regulating this, because obviously with these licensing deals and from the studio perspective, what's so important to these studios is going to be exercising control and making sure that the licensed content is something that they're comfortable with. How do you think about those issues, and how does Disney actually control use of its IP at AI scale?
Right. Well, what I think about is there are going to be disputes arising all over the place because this is a very, very hard thing to control. Now, the deal has been announced that Disney will be able to retain control, and how that gets done again relates back to what we were talking about earlier as far as the transactional attorneys who are hammering out the deal points. My guess is that OpenAI will be on the hook for regulating exploitation on Sora on the site, and that Disney will then have retain the obligation to regulate the exploitation of any content created on Sora that's then used elsewhere. Uh, but how they do that, I mean, there are a number. OpenAI can regulate prompts and have regulations kind of on the front end of what is allowed to be created. But I mean, regulating at this scale where it's very different from regulating in the environment that we have been working in. So it remains to be seen where we go.
Yeah, I mean, historically, when you're licensing your IP, you have approval over the deliverables that are being created and put out there into them.
Absolutely.
Now we're
Right.
talking about a dynamic where what are those deliverables going to look like and who's actually creating them? It's a whole new set of considerations, but I have to believe that the technology that's available internally at these platforms is something that they're talking about so that they can really collaborate to make this something that's effective, but also doesn't sort of overregulate and over control what's being done by the fans, right? Because fundamentally, they're going to be driving this, and they're the ones who are going to be uplifting all of this content.
Absolutely. I think it really is going to require a intelligent and carefully thought through set of ground rules that allow users to create content that stays within the guardrails of what Disney has in mind as far as how it wants its IP to be used. But again, not overly regulating to take the fun out of what users want to do with this opportunity. Um, What's really interesting to me, though, David, on this issue is then who owns the content after it has been created? I know that historically users have owned the content that they created on Sora. Now, obviously, Disney's going to retain ownership over the underlying IP. And I don't think that they have disclosed yet exactly how they're going to formulate their terms of service as far as how, what rights users do have to the content that they create and whether they can then exploit it downstream. But to a point you said earlier, there have been announcements about potential exploitation of content created by users on Disney Plus, which I think is interesting and problematic for a number of reasons. I mean, there's only so much. It's going to be taking the space of content that folks in the guilds that I represent are out there creating and trying to sell. It's taking airtime away, which is very concerning for the guilds. But how is that even going to work? Are the users who have created these Sora content, are they going to be paid a license fee for exhibition of their work on Disney Plus? Um, are they going to be able to exhibit their content elsewhere on YouTube? Are there going to be issues then with exclusivity? It's very interesting, and it to be for us still to learn how these are going to be regulated.
Yeah, I think you hit on a really fascinating issue and an important trend creatively, right? Because if you ask Ted Sarandos at Netflix who his biggest competition is, he says it's
YouTube.
right. And so, this world, the influencer economy that we're in, the world of user-generated content is exploding. It's a new place for fans and creators to go to interact with each other. And to your point, Disney being a first mover in this area, it's showing that interest in trying to to exploit these trends and stay ahead of it in a way. But, from the copyright lawyer perspective, from the creative perspective, the guild perspective, I mean, what happens if one of these users is creating something that's derivative of a Star Wars, property, for example, but they
Right.
create something completely new and out of whole cloth, as we might say, right? A new character, something entirely new. Who owns that? And then how does that get exploited? And are they going to be compensated for that? So, and to your point as well, there's always this concern that the more attention is going into these areas and more money is going into these areas, the less money there is and attention there is for the traditional creator economy that we know here in Hollywood. That's so important, not just creatively, right, in terms of the actors and writers, producers who we work with and love, but the people who work in town and who support these productions from a physical production perspective from the guild.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I live in Burbank, and a lot of parents of my kids' friends are very concerned about where things are headed, and for exactly the reasons that you just described.
The questions is why now and why is Disney doing it now? What is the response been? But I think you've kind of hit on that in terms of why there's such a tension here. And obviously, as we're going into this new season of guild negotiations, the renegotiations of all the guild agreements, I think this is probably something that people are paying very close attention to over within the guild space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. To the question, though, of why now, I think that it was strategically really interesting for Disney to take this step and be the first mover. Think there are a lot of reasons why it was a good move for Disney, given that after its launch, Sora really has not taken off in the way that I think that OpenAI had hoped it would, at least initially, before it shifted into an opt-in type approach as opposed to an opt-out approach for use of IP. And so Disney, as a first mover, and given that Sora has been in a somewhat more vulnerable position, had a lot of leverage so that it could extract as good of a deal for itself as possible, including, and this is one of the terms that we didn't cover earlier, only 1 year of exclusivity with OpenAI over the 3-year term. The other 2 years, it's a non-exclusive use of the Disney IP. So potentially Disney is thinking about additional deals with other generative AI players. I'm assuming they're probably already in talks about this, given the terms here have already, are allowing for non-exclusivity. And so it's it really made a lot of sense for Disney. Also, I think that it strengthens its litigation position in connection with its lawsuit against Midjourney, which you referenced at the start of the podcast. That is a suit where Disney is suing with a number of other players, NBC Universal, Warner Brothers, for both use of IP in the training of the AI and also copying in the outputs of the AI. And here, Disney is showing, okay, this is how you do it. Here, this is how you can actually contractually work with the generative AI company and create guardrails upon use and create and actually contract for the use of our IP, as opposed to the exact opposite of what Midjourney did.
Right. So you're getting into a really fascinating area within the litigation landscape now, which is this distinction between training and outputs, right? And and maybe you could speak to sort of how the deal itself deals with that because it's not covered, right?
Sure, absolutely. And I think Disney was very careful in this in order to kind of protect its litigation position, particularly in this Midjourney lawsuit. So it has licensed the use of the IP for outputs for these user-generated videos, but it has absolutely prohibited the use of OpenAI to use the Disney IP to train the IP. And that distinction is critical. And it also cabins the impact of this deal on the ongoing copyright disputes. It's not like this deal is now dispositive or defines what is fair use. Those questions are still absolutely churning in the courts. But it does provide a framework and shows that there is a market that exists for IP holders to directly work with the generative AI companies for permissive use of the IP, which
Yeah,
really hadn't been done before.
it really is sort of a tremendous development in terms of the litigation, and I think what all the parties to these cases are thinking about. And so what I hear you saying is, in the context of these copyright infringement lawsuits that have been filed in the Northern District of California, for example, and all throughout the country, and really throughout the there's sort of two theories and two pieces that are going on. One is that the owners of this IP are suing and they're saying you're training your large language models and ingesting our content without our consent, and that's a copyright infringement. And of course, the defense is from OpenAI itself and these other platforms is, well, it's a fair use and it's a transformative use, and there's a lot of analysis that goes into that. But they're basically saying we have the right to do this under copyright law. We don't need your permission or consent. And then the other part of these suits is they're talking about what the outputs look like, so that if you actually uh, input a Disney character into like Midjourney's platform, for example, which is not part of this deal, then you can create a Darth Vader in a different context, right? And you can create outputs themselves are potentially substantially similar within the language of the statutes and infringing too. So it sounds like what you're saying is Disney has really sort of tried to thread the needle here, and on the one hand say we're still taking the position that training requires our consent and that these are not fair uses within the context of these cases. But when it comes to the output side, we're going to work with you to potentially license our IP. But the two issues sort of bleed together, right? There's been this conversation about is there really a market for these works? And I think what you're talking
Exactly.
about now is the fact that this deal does reflect that there is some market. And hasn't that had some impact on sort of what's happening in the litigation already from your perspective?
Absolutely. Well, yes, there just recently there's a suit that's going in in the Southern District of New York, the Authors Guild against OpenAI, and they have actually subpoenaed from OpenAI copies of this particular deal along with a number of other pieces of information, correspondence, drafts, etc., for that particular reason to prove that there is a market for these licenses and there is an ability for IP holders to contract directly with the generative AI companies. And so this deal is very much at issue and could have a great impact on this ongoing piece of litigation.
Yeah, it opens up a whole new can of worms, really, right? For
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if in discovery they learn that OpenAI has taken different positions on how it internally values this IP versus litigation positions it's taken as far as how it considers its position in connection with fair use of the content, that it could really blow up the litigation.
Yeah, now of course we're dealing with very sophisticated parties with very smart lawyers, and I'm sure they're anticipating a lot of these concerns. And to go back to sort of what the deal looks like itself, one of the things I'm sure they're going to be talking about that's very different and interesting is that this deal also included an opportunity for Disney to invest $1 billion into OpenAI. And do we know anything about how the deal is structured in terms of if Disney's going to be paid for the use of this IP or what that's going to look like? Because I'm sure all those considerations will affect these fair use, arguments that are happening in the courts.
Absolutely. So from what I understand, it seems that Disney will be paid through its participation in its investment in OpenAI, and it has this $1 billion investment as well as warrants to purchase greater interest as OpenAI potentially, hopefully, in Disney's mind, continues to increase in value. And so Disney is really linking itself to OpenAI's long-term success through the course of this deal. And so Disney will get paid if OpenAI is able to monetize these tools in the ways that it thinks it will be able to. And from a licensing standpoint, that makes sense. I was thinking about this earlier today. It would be very difficult to come up with some sort of licensing formula for the use of the characters, or if it was in any way tied to the specific use of specific characters, given that it will be extremely hard to both to even know, given that users have complete control over that.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to the technology issue and what sort of tracking and monitoring and policing is going to be available and how do you tie it back? And that I think that presents one of the really thorny issues in this litigation about training itself, right? And how do you value this underlying IP that's being ingested given what the outputs look like? And they may look like the IP, they may look very different in that sense. And so it seems like there's a consensus from the creative community, at least, that there's a value that's being contributed. But the real question is going to be, how do you how do you quantify that and monetize that? Um,
Yeah, and I think there's another consensus among the creative community that this is not a step forward for anyone. I know that there have been statements issued by WGA and SAG-AFTRA that expressing grave concerns about the impact on the creative economy, as we were talking about earlier, across the board.
yeah, man, I think it highlights one of the big tensions that we're dealing with right now as this technology advances, and how is it going to be used? How is it going to be incorporated? There's a quality of incorporating it on the production side to make productions more efficient, but then there's the fundamental challenge to how we create in this modern world, and a lot of talent has spoken on that. Do you think that this deal with Disney is a bellwether or an outlier? I mean, do you think the other studios are going to follow Disney's lead? It seems like the train is leaving the station in some sense, but there's a lot of pushback.
That's a great question, David. Disney is uniquely suited for some of the reasons that you mentioned earlier. I mean, these are animated works. They're, wholly owned by Disney, and in large part from um, Disney has complete control over licensing. Whereas it may not be so easy for other entertainment conglomerates to enter into a deal like this. Like, for example, let's think of Warner Brothers. Now, I'm sure that there's a huge appetite out there for users to be able to access, for example, the universe of Harry Potter, right? But then you're dealing with, okay, well, what rights to Harry Potter does Warner Brothers have? Well, it has the rights to the film, but I'm sure that that it obviously doesn't have rights to the underlying literary works. And so what can Warner Brothers actually license out to a generative AI company? And that's just one example of many, but it really shows that it's going to be complicated for other studios to enter into similar deals.
Yeah, I think that's right. My point was going to say, what does J.K. Rowling have to say about
Right,
this?
exactly.
And to your point originally, this deal excludes the likenesses and the performances of actors that we know and love, but oftentimes those actors and their voices can become very sort of intimately intertwined with the characters themselves. And you can imagine there's going to be a lot of cases on the edge that are going to potentially spawn some disputes and some questions about this as well.
Absolutely. I see right of publicity cases coming down the pike. The question will be then, who do you go after, right? And I think that OpenAI and Disney are obviously carefully parsing those issues in connection with drafting the terms of these deals.
Yeah, and I think that's going to feed into these guild negotiations as well. The guilds say that they're carefully watching this, and we certainly see within the context of the music industry more collaborations evolving for the use of underlying user compositions by these
Mhm.
platforms. And I think the details on how the artists are going to be compensated are still murky, we should say. But from the perspective of someone who's a mediator and yet you're a litigator, we often work together to craft solutions that involve a more collaborative approach. And I think that, this partnership between Disney and AI is a good example of what the parties can come up with themselves when they're trying to be cooperative and effectively make the pie bigger, and things that they can come up with that you can't get from a judge in court, right? And so think that these guild negotiations are going to be another opportunity to talk about how can we make the pie bigger. I was at the UCLA conference last summer, I think, and there was a gentleman from OpenAI who was sitting on the stage who was involved in these types of partnerships. And what they're trying to say is that there's a responsible way to collaborate, to exploit this IP, to work with the artists, to support the creative community, and they want to be at the forefront of that dialogue. And this is definitely, I think, an example of them making that effort. People have different opinions on whether or not,
Absolutely.
but certainly it reflects the new reality we're in.
Absolutely. I mean, AI is not going anywhere. It's a reality that we all have to grapple with. And as you said, we're going to get some answers from the courts about what is fair use and what's not. But in the meantime, um, I, yeah, I take some hope in this collaboration between Disney and OpenAI to potentially work together to create something really exciting and new that doesn't trespass on Disney's IP and also doesn't trespass on um, creators' rights to their content. And this is by no means dispositive. The fight will go on, but and it will be interesting to see how the rollout actually goes once it happens. But we shall see.
Yeah, I mean, it's as you said earlier on, there's often a lot more questions than there are answers when we have these types of conversations. And it seems like there's maybe a movement towards a landscape that involves more consent and permissions and compensation, in certain respects at least. But I guess it's just maybe to sort of to close out this conversation, what do you think that non-entertainment lawyers should take away from this deal and where things are headed in this area?
Sure. Well, I think that this is not about whether or not AI will exist. It's a first stab, I see, as a major IP holder venturing into the space while still trying to retain control and consent over its IP. It's risk allocation given this uncertain environment. And it doesn't end the copyright wars. We'll still have those ongoing, but it does show how powerful players like Disney and OpenAI are positioning themselves to continue forward while these wars are still being fought.
Yeah, and I think it really demonstrates it's better to be at the table than not when it comes to having these conversations and obviously being a part of these lawsuits, and we'll see how things develop. Well, Julia, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. Do you have any parting thoughts or predictions, or can I give you the final word in terms of?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think we've been alluding to it throughout. The proof is in the pudding. And I know that Disney and OpenAI have best intentions to make this work, but I do see many avenues of potential dispute arising as we move forward.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's a lot of stakeholders who are going to be watching very close,
Very closely.
from the talent community, from the technology community, and beyond. So thank you very much, Julia Cherlow, for your contributions today and obviously sharing your expertise and your insight. It's been a pleasure to have the conversation with you, and we'll look forward to maybe we can revisit this topic down the road and see what the landscape looks like then.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. This was a pleasure.